Good evening. Tonight I'd like to talk about a new type of Krytox lube that I found online that I thought was interesting. It is called Krytox 157 FSH. The FS stands for functional series. This is what's known as a functional fluid. So this is fluorine grease that has been chemically altered so that it will stick better and not beat up as much on smooth surfaces. So that sounded like a good thing for keyboard switches. However, I had a bit of a challenge with this stuff, how to get a consistent amount of this oil on the paintbrush or applicator each time I lubed a switch. My thinking is if I can get quickly and easily a consistent amount on the brush every time, then if I do a consistent technique of applying the lube to the switch, the end result should be that the lube job should be consistent on all the switches. Right? So with that in mind, I was thinking about different ways. Some people use a palette where they'll load their brush or their applicator and then they'll wipe some of it off until they think they've got about a consistent amount on the brush, about the same amount every time. I wanted something quicker than that though. So here's what I came up with. I have this little container into which I've poured some of the oil, as you can see. Now this container came with a lid, which I've drilled a hole in, and in that lid, up inside the lid, was a plastic disc which I've cut a hole in, and then I have glued to the top side a 1mm thick layer of silicone material that I bought on Amazon, and I can share the link. This is some of the leftovers of it. It comes with a thin plastic backing, but it's just this rubbery silicone stuff. And then I cut a little slit in that silicone for the applicator to go through. So the thinking here is that when I go to load my applicator with grease, it'll go through this slit, and then when it comes back out, the rubbery stuff will squeegee off the excess and hopefully do that consistently enough that I'll just end up with just a little bit on the applicator, and hopefully it'll be consistent enough each time. Now the applicators I'm using I also purchased on Amazon. They're these micro applicators. I think they're typically used for applying makeup. I can share the link to those too. So first thing I do, I've put the oil into the container already. Now I have to try to screw this lid on and get the holes to all line up with each other. So let me just do that. There's a little plastic burr that I didn't catch. I'm just going to get out of the way here real quick. Okay, so I'll put it with the plastic wafer side down, closer to the jar, and the rubbery stuff touching the lid. Oops. Get on there nice and tight. Now let's see if I can stick the applicator through that slit. Back out. Now if I stick it all the way to the bottom, pull it back out, it'll come out with oil on it. So now I'm going to use that technique, and now you can see the oil that got squeegeed off the excess. See that little drop of excess? So that's the technique I'm going to try to use to save some time here. Grab my lube station. We'll do 10 switches total. 5 with this new technique, and 5 we'll just assemble unlubed to act as our control. Because I figure if the switches feel inconsistent, or if you can't really tell that they've been lubed, they don't feel really smooth, then it's probably not, or if they don't sound any different, it's probably not an effective technique. Now the other thing to consider about this stuff, this Krytox 157 FSH, is it's tenacious enough and clings so well that, and it's also so slippery and high viscosity, that I suspect that if I use it to lube the key friction points of the housing, I may actually not need to lube the stems at all, because every part of the stem that rubs against something either rubs against the switch top, the switch housing, or the switch leaf. So as long as I lubricate each of those key friction points there in the housing and in the top, it seems to me like I shouldn't need to also lube the stems, which will save lube and will also save time, because the stems have a lot of surface area on them that doesn't come into contact with anything else. So lubing all of the surfaces of the stem would seem like possibly wasteful. So these will be the tops that I don't lube. These are all my stems. So let's get started. So the technique I'm going to use on the housings is I'm going to just poke this in, pull it out. Then I'm going to swab each leaf up and down on each of the rails. Then on the center post hole, I'm going to go down to the bottom and kind of swirl around in a circle as I come back out. See what I mean? Kind of swirl around to try to lubricate the inside of that hole, because the stem has a post in the middle that will rub against the inside edge of that hole. So let me just do these 5 switches real fast. Leaf, leaf, rail, rail, and then post hole. See how fast that is to load your brush with this little gizmo that I've made? Now, as I said, I'm going to make sure to do the tops as well. So when I lube the tops, the technique I'm going to do there is I'm going to touch the spots where the switch tops out, because that makes the top out quieter. So that's these 2 spots. And then I'm going to hit these 4 rails on the top and bottom of the opening, because those rub against the stem. And then I'm going to get up in the very corner for these side rails, because those side rails also rub on the stem. Now this lubing of the switch tops probably seems a little bit tedious, but once again, if it doesn't take you very long to load your brush, it doesn't have to take very long to do this, and you don't have to do the stems potentially because this grease is so viscous. I mean, this oil. This oil is so viscous and tenacious that the hope here is that you may actually not need to do the stems at all, which would make up for the extra time you spent doing your tops. So it really doesn't take very long, as you can see. The side rails are the part that's the hardest, but I'm sure with more practice I'll get used to it. Get faster at it. The top and bottom rails are pretty fast. It's mainly the side rails that are a little bit harder to get at for me. Just a little bit. Five switches done here. Now, let me just put this aside. Get some springs. Now these springs are Cat Wheelie 72 gram gold-plated springs that have already been lubed. If you're going to do this technique with this oil, then I still recommend lubing your springs. In fact, I always recommend lubing your springs, because if you don't, they'll probably make noise. Even the best springs can have some level of ping. So if there's one thing in your switch that I think you should never skip lubing, it's the spring. So on both the experimental group and the control group, I'm going to just put these lubed springs. Now for springs, I don't think you need to be super picky about how you lube them. I think you can tub lube them, you can spray lube them if you have an appropriate spray lube, or you can bag lube them. Whatever works for you is fine. We'll put the stems on. Hopefully my work surface is relatively dust free here. I use some canned air to blow it off. So the top 5 switches have been lubed with this new tool and new oil and new method of doing things. The bottom 5 are stock, except for the spring. Now these are, if I didn't mention it before, these are retooled Cherry MX Blacks. Let's see how they sound. Put some keycaps on them to make this easier. Well, first let's see if there's a noticeable difference in the way they sound. Bring the microphone in real close. Here's the stocks. Here's the stocks, except for the spring, of course. Here's the lubed. talk. Lubed. Now I think because this is a thick piece of acrylic, it's probably actually making things a little bit easier for the sound of these switches to sound good. This will focus better. Come on. If it was in an actual keyboard, I think you would find that the sound difference would be actually even more noticeable between the lubed and the unlubed. These are lubed. Unlubed. But now, let's see. Do they feel consistent? To me they do. But what I'm curious about is whether they feel good enough that I can actually tell that they're lubed. So I thought something fun we could do is just jumble them all up together. Jumble them all up together. So I don't know at this point which ones are lubed and which ones aren't. Then I'll do a blind test here, just for fun. Let's see if I can pick which ones are lubed and which ones aren't. Okay. Now, if I think they're lubed, I'm going to put them on the top. And if I think they're not, I'm going to put them on the bottom. Let's see here. All right. Let's see how I did. Now when I lubed the tops, a little bit of lube accidentally gets on the outside of the top, so we should be able to tell whether the switches was lubed by me just now, based on whether it has a little bit of grease on the, or oil on the outside of the top that's smeared on to the outside when I was applying it to the rails. Let's see how we did in our little guessing game here. These are the ones that I thought felt like the unlubed switches. There's a couple of little traces of oil. It looks like oil. What about the other ones? The ones I thought felt lubed. Oops, let me turn them all the same orientation. Every single one so far, yeah. Every single one of them has a big smear of oil that accidentally got on the outside. Yep. These are definitely the ones that I lubed. Now just to double check, if you really want to make sure, let's open them up and take a look. Because we should be able to tell for sure by looking up close at the stem. Actually, let's take a look at the stem under microscope. That'll be even easier to tell. Let me just make sure that I cycle these switches enough times that the lube will have worked its way in. If it's there, then it'll have spread onto the stem enough so that we'll be able to see traces of it on the stem. Oh, if you want to know what I'm doing here, with the switch lube plate upside down, I'm just cycling all the switches at once while moving it in a circular motion, which drags the stems against my rubber work surface, my silicone work surface. And so that puts some lateral pressure on the stems in all different directions and helps make sure that the stems rub against all the friction surfaces of the housings. So now let's take a look. Let's see, out of the ones that I thought were lubed, let's see how accurate I was. Okay, number one. Let's take a look here. You can clearly see the tracks where the lube has been dragged onto the stem. On the back side, you can see it got dragged onto the side rails of the stem. Well, one of them. There you see it got dragged onto the other side rail. You can see the side of the switch itself has tracks from the lube on the switch top. You can see lube on the legs of the switch smeared on there. And you can see tracks where it got rubbed onto the stem on the front from the switch top. So this is clearly one of the switches that I lubed. Not to mention that you were able to see the kind of mess of oil on the top of the switch from applying lube to the switch top. Let's check another one. Tracks where the lube got dragged onto the stem. I see some on the side rail a little bit. I see the side contact points where the switch top drags. I see some on the front. So this once again appears to be a lubed switch. And you saw it was pretty easy for me to identify which ones were lubed just by pressing them a few times, even with the blindfold on. Yeah, this one's been lubed. See right there? That's where I rubbed against the switch top. So looks like we're three for three so far. Now I probably could have just marked each one of these switches before I did the blind test. That would have been an easier way to tell whether I guessed right or not. But this works well enough. Looks good. One more to check. Yep. So as you can see, I was able to easily identify the lubed switches 100% of the time. And they all have very similar looking patterns of lube on them. Now if you want to see what one of the unlubed switches looks like for comparison, if you're curious, let me just grab one of those stems and you can see the difference. Stem that has not been lubed. There is some faint trace of something there, but it might just be wear. I don't know. But it's not a big smear of grease or oil, I mean, like you saw on the lubed switches. This part's completely dry. Those friction points on the side that rub against the top, completely dry. The leg has some factory lube on it. Cherry factory lubes their switches, if you didn't know, but they usually only lube the leg and maybe the leaf. The front surface where it rubs against the switch top, no trace of any lube. And once again the side, no trace of any lube. So interestingly though, some kind of factory lube on the post. So so you know, it would appear that Cherry lubes the legs and maybe the post. But that's what a switch that I didn't lube looks like. A stock Cherry MX retooled black. So I think that this is a nice, quick and easy technique to use for the higher viscosity oils and greases. Something like a 206 or a 107 or a 157 in this case. The 157 I think is really interesting because it's so sticky and tenacious, but the danger is you have to really be careful not to apply too much with something like that, or else it makes your switch feel sluggish. So that's why I think this is a really good technique to apply if you're going to use a really tenacious high viscosity lube, because this technique, since I'm not even applying it to the stem, it really makes it easier not to over lube, and you still get a good smooth result because the surfaces where the stem rubs against the housing or against the leaf are going to rub against that lube that you put on the housing and on the leaf and on the switch top. So you end up really not needing to lube the stem. So focus for 1 second here. That's it for tonight, and hope you learned something from this. It'll sound really good, and I'm excited to build a keyboard with the switches lubed this way. And thanks for watching. Good night.